I felt unusually sheepish about speaking and a bit unsure, given that advances in female equality and empowerment are not well served usually by middle-aged white men bumping their gums. In fact, I don't think it's ever well served.
Well, that's Bob Doris, SNP MSP. Sadly, he didn't heed his own advice and he's been at it again.
Bob Doris to be followed by Mark Ruskell. Bob Doris.
First Minister, BBC Social highlighted the practice of gaming by a so-called male pickup act artist in Glasgow, including footage on Maryhill Road. Whilst I would make no further comment of that specific matter, given it is now subject to a police investigation, does the First Minister agree with me that this would be a timely opportunity to encourage the public to participate in the Scottish Government's hate crime consultation, which is currently seeking, amongst other things, the public's views on recommendations around potential changes to the law on gender hostility and the stirring up of hatred?
First Minister.
Well, can I thank Bob Doris for raising this issue? I'm sure everybody in the Chamber would, like me, have been shocked and appalled by the BBC's investigation into so-called gaming. I watched the BBC social film and can say I was utterly sickened by what I saw. It did indeed, though, as Bob Doris says, highlight why there is such a clear need for action to be taken to tackle gender-based prejudice and indeed gender-based violence. Lord Brackadale's view in his report on hate crime was that there are patterns of offending which relate particularly to hatred based on prejudice towards the victim's gender and which should be addressed through reformed hate crime legislation. The current consultation seeks views on how best to tackle misogyny and gender-based prejudice in Scotland, and I would certainly encourage everyone who has an interest in this area, which should be all of us, to make their views known through the consultation process, which runs until the 24th of February.
So what's this all about? Hate crime, gender hostility, stirring up hatred, prejudice and violence, misogyny? Well, I'll give you my take on this case. I'll show the BBC video and talk over it. So this is about a so-called pick-up artist. A bloke in Glasgow who basically approaches girls in the street, tries to chat them up with the intention of having sex with them that day. Then he uploads his exploits to the internet, what some of them. I have to say, the ones I watched, it seems like his success rate is very, very low. Anyway, this bloke's explicit that he doesn't actually care about the girls. He's just after what he wants. But as he operates like a salesman, he's got a script trying to seal the deal with these women he approaches in the street. So a friend films it. Occasionally, well, only one case I could see, he films heading up to a room with a girl, allegedly an audio recording of the sex, a film of the girl asleep in bed. Now, if he's harassing people in the street, if he's been too persistent in his conversations, that could be a legal issue. If this filming and recording is without consent, okay, maybe that could be a case for the police as well. But overall, this bloke, though, I'd say is a sad case. It's hard to imagine he's not addicted to pornography. He's certainly sex obsessed and is obsessed with this so-called game of trying to chat up women. Where's that going to lead him? What's his life trajectory? Well, I'd say it's towards misery, sex addiction, loneliness, bitterness. So what's wrong with what he's doing? I would say there are 4 basic moral intuitions to do with sex that most people hold. The first one is that sex should be an exclusive relationship with one person only. He's obviously not following that. It should only be in committed long-term relationships. He's obviously not following that. It should be individuated. In other words, it should be a desire for a particular person rather than sex in general. So it's not okay to say, I felt like sex and there was Samantha, so she would do. There's something wrong with that. It should be, say, related to a relationship with a particular person. He's not following that either. And the last one is the desire for sex should be mutual. Well, that's maybe true in these cases. The girls are consenting, but he actually doesn't care if it's actually mutual desire or not, as long as he can persuade them over the line. So a score out of 4 there for his sexual morality. Scores about 0.5 out of 4. So he's got a pretty degenerate view of sex. Now, the police can decide if he's broken the law with anything that he's done. It is worth mentioning, though, these occasional girls who do actually seem to have sex with him, they should reflect on the influence their behaviour has on other girls and women, for example, in Glasgow. If one girl actually ends up with sleeping with this bloke, that probably keeps him going wandering the streets for the next 6 months in hope that he might find another one. So I'm sure some women are maybe irritated by him, but on the other hand, watching the videos, it seemed that quite a few women were quite happy to be flattered by him and to entertain conversation with him. But in having sex with these women, he'll be causing emotional damage to himself, but also particularly to the women and girls involved. So to say the least, his intentions are not entirely honourable. Now, we could debate how much worse he is than many guys chatting up girls in a nightclub, but that's basically my take of what the problem is with this bloke. Let's move on to Nicola Sturgeon and Bob Doris's take on this issue. It's all about hate crime, gender hostility, stirring up hatred, prejudice, gender-based violence, misogyny. Well, let's just look at some of those things. Gender-based violence, well, we can dismiss that one straight away because there's no violence involved here. Right, misogyny. Does this bloke hate women? I think he worships women, but he just sees them as sexual objects, though. But I don't think he hates them. He just selfishly uses them. And it's not because he's got something against women. It's because some women can supply what he wants. A woman that he finds unattractive, he wouldn't have that attitude towards them. Stirring up hatred and hostility. I mean, what he's basically doing is inciting men to be selfish in seeking to use women for sex, consensual sex, have to add. Does that amount to hatred? I'm not sure it does. Does that amount to hostility? I don't think so. Maybe he's urging men to treat women with contempt, with disregard, but it's not all women. And he's not aiming to make people anti-women. He's aiming to make people pro-themselves. He's promoting selfishness, not misogyny. Selfishness, where does that come in the politically correct dictionary? It's not there. So the MSPs don't see that so easily. They just reach for the tools to hand, which is it's hate speech, it's a hate crime, it's misogyny, all the familiar terms. Now, if it's to become an offence to promote degenerate conceptions of sexual ethics, there's going to be a heck of a lot of people being prosecuted for that. I mean, the Scottish Government, for example, looking at their sex education materials. I mean, in schools, the big emphasis is consent. If the girl is sober and conscious and agrees to sex, then that's okay. That's often the message presented. Or it's okay to have sex if you feel like it, or if you feel you know the person well enough, which again can endorse any sort of sexual relationship. But what this shows is the mission creep you can get with hate crime and hate speech legislation. So we've got there people in the Scottish Parliament who don't like what this bloke does. They don't like what he says. I don't like that either. But they call it hate. I call it what it actually is. So if we're going to start prosecuting people for saying, I tried to persuade girls who I don't care about to have sex with me, that's a pretty puritanical law. Because if it's illegal to try and persuade people to do that, it surely needs to be illegal to actually do it as well. And that really is becoming quite Taliban-esque. It's often it's the evangelical Christians that get accused of being like the Taliban. But, well, I think there's a stronger parallel to be drawn here. Once you've got the hate speech legislation hammer, every unpleasant utterance becomes a hate speech nail. And that's what we've got here. And obviously hate speech legislation would be used to enforce the sort of state orthodoxy, feminist, LGBT, protecting the sensibilities of Muslims, etc. Anything that goes against those things is going to be labelled as hate speech. A big problem with this is that in the Scottish Parliament there are lots of valid opinions that are never articulated by MSPs, partly because hardly any of them believe them, and partly because the ones who do don't say. They keep their heads down, they're more interested in their career and avoiding controversy than actually speaking the truth. So any view that's never spoken in the Scottish Parliament, it can be quite easy to label that as extremist or to even label it as hate. So the reason I've looked at this issue is it's an illustration of the hate speech mindset in action, applying the hate speech label to something entirely inappropriate. So Nicola Sturgeon said we should engage in the consultation. Who am I to argue? So I went along to one of the meetings they had. They're having, 11, 13, whatever, meetings around the country where anyone can go along and give their views on the proposed hate crime legislation. So I went to the one in Edinburgh. Now the main issue under discussion was whether or not it would be a good idea to take the current 5 separate laws that cover hate crime and to consolidate them into one single law. Which I said, that's like the question is it better have 5 small bad laws or 1 big bad law? I mean, what's my view on that? I mean, I really don't care. The whole idea of it's flawed. And the other question was about the offence of stirring up hostility. And that's the really concerning thing, because that's effectively a hate speech law. Currently, for a hate crime, you have to commit a crime, and then in addition, they might add on, say, a year to your sentence because they reckon it was motivated by hate. I've always said, by that logic, if you get, say, 3 years for attacking someone and beating them up, and an extra year because you hated them, surely logic dictates that if you haven't actually beaten them up, but you just hate them, that deserves a year of imprisonment. And that's the logic that's coming through. So stirring up hostility is on its way. Now, I spoke to a couple of people who've been to other consultations in this series, someone who went in Stornoway, someone who went in Inverness. And in both cases, they said that the people there were very definitely against the very concept of hate crime legislation, and they said so in no uncertain terms. And at the end of one of the meetings, someone at one of them spoke to one of the civil servants, a representative of the government, and said, well, people here are pretty hostile to the whole idea of hate crime. What will the government take from this? What message will you take away from it? And the civil servant replied, the message we'll take is that we need to work harder to communicate with people what this is all about. In other words, they didn't entertain for a moment the possibility that what they're doing is wrong and the public might have valid concerns about it. That's just dismissed entirely. They're so cocksure that they're on the moral and intellectual high ground. It's just a matter of educating the less enlightened to bring them up to the same level. So the one I went to in Edinburgh, it was laid out as about, 50 people there maybe. Different tables were about 8 people at each table. My table, the sort of people that go to these is mainly people who work for unions, sock puppet charities, education, other government organisations. Basically, it's the establishment. So they're sort of professionally, politically correct, and they arrive in such numbers that basically whatever happens, that view is going to come through most strongly. But at my table, there was myself and 2 others as well, who very definitely took a different view. But a few quotes from some of the people at my table. This is from an equality officer in a state educational establishment. I won't give too much away so these people can be identified. But she said, maybe it would be better if more white people did feel they were bad people because they're white and have benefited from privilege. Right, here's another one. I said, for example, I'll give you an illustration of a view that people might regard as hate speech or inciting hatred. There's actually nothing of the sort. I said, for example, I believe that it's not possible to change sex and that transgenderism is a mental health problem. And then later on, a representative of a major union in Scotland said, we need hate speech laws so that people rein in their comments and think twice before they speak. For example, we don't want people to think they can say that transgendered people have a mental health problem. So she's quite happy just to point blank say that a perfectly reasonable opinion like that should be covered by hate speech legislation. Later in the discussion, I said to this union official, I said, you support hate crime, hate speech legislation, because it flows from your own political ideology. You're always talking about oppressed and oppressor groups dividing society into competing factions. It's a sort of cultural Marxist approach, and that's why you're for hate speech legislation, because it's a reflection of that philosophy. One of the ladies at the table said, can we please treat each other as human beings instead of saying we have ideologies? What? I mean, what can you say? I mean, but that's you just think, is there any point trying to carry on discussing? Right, another quote from an educationalist in Scotland. When things go badly for someone, they can take out the resentment on groups and become hateful, instead of doing something positive, like blaming the government. These are the people educating people in Scotland. Anyway, so we had the discussion at the group. Then at the end, there was an open question time where a civil servant stood up at the front and just chose people from the tables to make individual comments. Now, the first person he chose was a man from a table next to mine, and he launched into a pretty good speech about the dangers of hate crime, how it's divisive, brings resentment, that various groups are getting special treatment. He really laid into it. It was great. So the host sort of shut him up as soon as he could and moved on to someone else in the hope he could get a more amenable response. But he chose me. So I said that the previous speaker had said that the unintended consequence would be that this would divide society into competing groups. And I said, well, actually, I don't think that's an unintended consequence. That's the intended consequence. It divides society into competing groups, many of which feel oppressed. Then the government can present itself as the ally to these groups and thereby win favour with them. And the host could barely contain his unhappiness with that response. So he moved on. He was desperately hoping that the gambler's fallacy, in fact, it wasn't a fallacy, it was true. So third time lucky, he went to someone else. And that man stood up and said he'd looked into this quite thoroughly. He'd looked at research on hate crime legislation around the world. And the universal conclusion where proper research had been done is that it doesn't work. It makes problems worse. And he said the Scottish government completely ignores all of this research. Fantastic. At this point, a lady, a civil servant at another table, stood up. She wasn't leading the session, she just stood up. And she said, right, thank you, we can leave it there, we don't need to hear anything else. Thank you very much for the questions. We'll leave it there, thanks, we can all go home now. That's enough, thank you. Usurping the authority of the man at the front, quite clearly. I mean, maybe she was the boss. But anyway, in that context, he was leading the session. But the man wasn't having any of it. And he said, no, I think we'll have one more question. And he did pick someone else for a question. Then they did waffle away with some things that fit in with the government's agenda. So it's quite an interesting morning. When the bill's debated in Parliament, I'll make a video on it. But I went to that consultation not thinking that anything I said was going to make any difference at all. I just went for the experience and to see what was happening. When this is debated in the Scottish Parliament, the standard of debate won't rise much above, we're nice people, so we think hate's bad, we think crime's bad, so we should have hate crime legislation. When they debated it before, a few months ago, that was about all that was said. Filling in the consultation, to be honest, I'm not going to bother. I think it makes no difference. Trying to feed into this process doesn't work. We're a democracy. The way things are going to change is having MSPs in there and political power and a voice in the Parliament. You can fill in as many consultations as you like. They're just going to be ignored. So as the Scottish Family Party, why are we so interested in freedom of speech? There's two reasons why freedom of speech is a crucial issue. Number one, we want to avoid injustices. If this law goes through, people are going to face legal consequences for doing nothing more than expressing unorthodox opinions, or maybe expressing unorthodox opinions in clumsy ways. Okay, maybe people who might be less educated, or they might be quite wound up about something. They might say something in a way that other people might be able to pick a hole in it, or see that's not quite the right way to say it. And instead of explaining to them, they'll find themselves with a knock on the door from the police. So we want to avoid injustices. And the second reason we're bothered about freedom of speech is we want to keep society on track. If challenging flawed ideas becomes impossible, then we can go further and further in dangerous directions. I think that's already happening. Now, the way that happens is partly someone who might speak out about something might be prosecuted by the police and therefore prevented from doing so. But that's not the main effect. The main effect is the chill it produces through society. If someone gets arrested for something, even if they're released without charge, the vast majority of people who are thinking of saying the same thing will think, I'll just leave it. I won't bother. It's not worth the hassle. So that's what we think is crucial. And in Scotland, things are going wrong in this area at a pretty rapid rate. Okay, thanks for watching. Do subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow us on Facebook as well. We are a political party. You can join us via the link below. Also, there's an email address below if you want to fire an email address over to us. We'll put you on our newsletter list. Thanks for watching.